And there's the weird electronic voice. Great. So yeah, I've been asked to talk about how arts and culture can help communicate climate change effectively. So as I said, I work at Creative Carbon Scotland. We are a charity, we're about 10 years old, and we work on the roles of arts and culture in addressing climate change here in Scotland. That means a few different things. So one is simply helping the cultural sector to reduce its environmental impact and adapt to the effects of climate change. So finding ways to use less power, run in a more efficient way, use less resources and so on. That's our kind of carbon management strand of work. We also run something called the Green Arts Initiative, which is a collection of, I think, over 350 arts organisations now across Scotland who are all working on trying to improve their environmental impact in various ways. If you are here from an arts or cultural organisation, you will be eligible to join that. So I'd recommend having a look at that if that's something that interests you. We also work on mobilising the power of culture to influence broader changes required to respond to climate change. This is more the side of work I'm going to be talking about today. So why we think arts and culture do have an important role to play, and actually the much larger transformation that our whole society needs to undergo in order to act on climate change in an effective and just way. We tend to call that our culture shift area of work. And we're also very interested in developing collaboration between the cultural and climate fields. So we do a lot of work trying to connect up people working on climate change with people working in the cultural sector, trying to do events that bring these different communities together, running projects that bring together people from these two different backgrounds to work together. And I'll give an example of that later on in this presentation. So that's just a bit about us to set the scene. So if, like me, you've been reading the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report on climate change recently, it does make for some what feels like quite depressing reading, both in terms of its content and the comments that have been made on it by people like the UN Secretary General. I think when reading this kind of stuff, especially for someone like me coming from an arts and cultural background, it's easy to feel quite disempowered and hard to find your role within these really huge trends. So that the need for an immediate carbon reduction, the opposition from status quo interests, the fact that, yeah, phrases like many ecosystems are at the point of no return now, it's very easy to feel like it's hard to find your role. And I think it's something people have already talked about today, that the difficulty of communicating about climate change without falling into this depressive state. But I think, yeah, despite this, these worries, I think there is a clear role for arts and culture to have in all this, although it's not sometimes immediately obvious. So I'm going to try and just sort of lead through the steps of why I think, in the context of this alarm call from the IPCC, there is a clear role for arts and culture. I think one first thing to note, which is really important, is that humans are not convinced just by facts. This is something that is essentially common knowledge in things like behavioral science or communications, widely acknowledged that, as George Lakoff puts it, real reason is mostly unconscious, requires emotion, uses the logic of frames, metaphors, and narratives, is physical and varies considerably. Truth must be framed effectively to be seen at all. So when thinking about how we communicate climate change, I think this is really important, that we know it's not just a matter of reciting the very important and correct facts and data and expecting people to act on them. We know that that doesn't tend to happen. And I think that's because as humans, we just have this illogical aspect to us, which we have to embrace when thinking about how we communicate climate change. And I think this is something that's recognized by the IPCC themselves. It's notable that the cover of the report, to the 6th assessment report, is actually a piece of art created by an artist called Elisa Singer, who created this visual, which is meant to communicate something of the sense of the changing state of our world, which they used as the cover. So they deliberately accompanied it with this kind of imagery, which already goes beyond the facts and tries to set up a certain way of framing or thinking about it. So I think that was quite interesting to see that they published it that way. So I think that's the first key strand, that we need to go beyond thinking about just facts. We also know that climate change is in many ways a cultural issue. It is, of course, it's a technical and scientific issue as well, but it's also an issue of how we think and how we behave. It's not limited just to that scientific realm. So I'm quite interested by this quote from the organization Climate Outreach, who talked about how decades of scientific consensus, summits, and traditional environmental campaigns clearly weren't mobilizing society to take action. Pointing to the science wasn't enough, something was missing. And also, kind of coming from a cultural angle, the author Amitav Ghosh wrote this book, The Great Derangement, in which he states simply, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination. So when thinking about how we address climate change, yes, finding technical solutions is important, but also finding new ways of thinking and behaving and imagining both individually and collectively has to be part of the picture too, for us to be able to work effectively. We also know that arts and culture do influence change. So to kind of put one spin on this, a survey by the organization Culture Council in 2020 found that 86% of adults in Scotland were culturally engaged and 83% participated in cultural activity. It's notable that this is figures from during COVID, when a lot of the cultural sector was in a state of being semi-closed down. So in fact, in normal times, the figures are likely to be slightly higher than this. So we know that if you're simply interested in trying to reach people with your messages, the arts and culture sector does reach most of the population. And then the figure on the left, I think, is an interesting one for me. It comes from a book written by Van Jones, who is a political strategist primarily and worked on various election campaigns, including the campaign to elect Barack Obama in 2008. He suggested that to bring about change in society, we need action from these 4 different realms. And 3 of them, I think, are the ones that we tend to think of as obvious ones when working on climate change. So inside, the realm of government; outside, campaigners and activists; head, researchers. I think these are all very widely recognized. And then he also suggests this heart space of artists and cultural producers, which I think is not so often recognized, but he suggests that in order to bring about meaningful change, you do need to have action in that space as well, in order to set the framing that's needed for meaningful action to take place. So again, interesting to have that take from someone who is not himself an artist or working in the cultural sector. And if we look to the distant and recent past, there are a number of examples of how cultural projects have brought around change in society. So here's just 2 examples. So one is a play called The Island, which was based on Nelson Mandela's imprisonment at Robben Island prison. It wasn't possible for this play to be performed in South Africa at the time due to legal restrictions that were in place under the apartheid regime, but it was performed very actively abroad and was used in quite a strategic way that helped to build support for ending apartheid, and was used in a very deliberate way where performances were accompanied by calls to action to support things like boycotts and petitions. So the work of art itself helped to kind of create this emotional grounding and connection that then laid the groundwork that was needed for people to take action who might not have been motivated to do so otherwise. And then coming from a more obviously environmental angle, this is a painting by Thomas Moran called The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. His paintings and drawings were displayed in the US Congress by people who were trying to get Yellowstone to be designated the first American national park. And again, people didn't look at the painting and immediately say, oh, I'm going to make Yellowstone a national park. But what it did do is help set that unconscious framing that was needed to make those delegates more willing to then pass that motion to create the national park, which they did indeed do. And it's widely recognized that this, the installation of these images helps to get that motion passed. So there's a couple of interesting examples out of many. And then finally, I think it's important to note that when we started off as an organization, I think this was more of a fringe opinion to have, but I think the role is increasingly recognised. So the Scottish Government now recognises that culture and heritage have an important role to offer as part of public engagement, and obviously a major aspect of that is about communication. And there's more and more recognition from academics as well. So just kind of giving one example from an article written in 2019, which found that exposure to immersive activism art increased intentions to engage in actions to address pollution and climate change. So basically, people who took part in this work of art, which helped to experience what air pollution felt like in various different cities, and it's called Pollution Pods, created by an artist called Michael Pinsky. They found that when interviewed afterwards, they found an increased willingness to take action on the issues that their work of art raised. So hopefully that's kind of led us through the steps of why I think arts and culture do have an important role to play. So firstly, that when communicating about climate change, we have to think about non-rational aspects as well as rational aspects, and also about the social and cultural aspects of working on climate change. I'd now like to maybe just suggest what I think that means for the things that the arts can actually do in practice. So I'm just going to suggest a few examples. I think these are much more kind of my personal opinion. So these are things that I think tend to work from experience. I'm sure Hannah will have others to suggest as well. But yeah, a few thoughts from me. One is about making issues visible, comprehensible and relevant. So climate change as an issue is famously hard to visualize because it doesn't have a visible aspect to it in many ways. You can see its impacts, but you can't see the thing itself because it doesn't have a physical presence in that way. So working with things like the visual arts can help to make something that is quite hard to hold in our heads. And psychologists of climate change have actually found that there is some quality about climate change that makes it quite difficult to hold in your brain in that way. I think the visual arts in particular, as well as things like storytelling, can play a really important role in just making those issues visible and comprehensible in a way that is quite difficult otherwise. Another important aspect is about reaching new people in new ways. So we talk a lot in climate change communication about the difficulty of reaching beyond the usual suspect audiences. And I think the arts can find a really valuable way of doing this because different art forms all have their own different audiences. So for example, some high art, so-called art forms are particularly effective at reaching wealthier people in society, or a particularly important audience to try and reach, given that they have the largest carbon impacts. Other art forms might be particularly good at reaching disadvantaged groups who tend to be left out of discussions about climate change. So they can be an avenue to reaching people, and cultural producers and artists can often be quite helpful as trusted messengers. So if they have a particular relationship with the community already, people are much more likely to pay attention to what they're saying. Another angle is to do with framing and imagination. So in order to be able to act on climate change, we really have to believe that we are able to make a difference. I think this is something that people talk about quite a lot in climate change communications. It's not just enough to talk about what the issue is, but you have to convince people that that change is possible and that their actions will make a difference. And I think a big part of that is simply imagining positive futures. And I think that's a big and increasing role for the arts, is just trying to create a sense of what we actually want to create, as well as what we want to avoid. Creating spaces for discussion, consultation, and empowerment. I think this is a really key one, and one that perhaps we don't talk about so much, is that a lot of the public venues in our society, and particularly the venues that you don't have to pay money to go into, are cultural venues. So things like libraries, museums, art centres. These are really important spaces simply to get people together and talk. I think especially for a lot of environmental organisations that don't have their own spaces, I would advocate for trying to work with cultural venues to use as public facing spaces that provide an opportunity for discussion, which can be quite difficult to find otherwise. And I think following from that, building consensus and communities. So we know that addressing climate change as an individual issue is not enough. Individual action does something, but to be able to really act on climate change in a fully effective way, we have to work as communities and collectively. And I think things like collective and community art projects can be really effective at just bringing people together in a way that makes us feel connected to a wider movement. And then finally, of course, care and well-being. I think this is becoming more and more vital, that given the rise of eco-anxiety, simply providing spaces to recharge and provide support is becoming more and more important, and that's something that the arts can offer in spades. And of course, I've just put the unexpected, so it's part of the value of arts and culture that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get, and you might find all sorts of interesting outcomes which you don't know in advance. I think that's something that you get with the arts that you don't get so much elsewhere also. So I'm just going to end by giving a couple of examples of what I think this looks like in practice. Drawing on a recent project we've been running called Climate Beacons. So this was a project that was planned around COP26, where we wanted to work with arts and cultural organizations to do really effective public engagement around climate change that would take advantage of this moment. And we knew that we wanted to try and do some of these things that I talked about on the previous slide that we thought would make the most of the role of art. So forming connections, trying to reach new audiences, highlighting underrepresented or locally relevant issues, providing those spaces for reflection. And then I think finally particularly key was to encourage long-term changes. So we wanted to try and make sure that this wouldn't be a kind of a flash in the pan thing. It would be something that would lead to long-term changes to the ways things worked for the organizations involved and the people who took part. So we created this project called Climate Beacons for COP26 that involved collaborations between different arts and cultural organizations working in 7 different locations. So you can see on the little map, which is also the logo, that shows where the locations are. In each one, there were one or multiple cultural organizations, such as museums, art centers, theaters, and environmental organizations, which included research bodies, local community groups, as well as environmental agencies. And they worked together to try and do forms of public engagement on climate change that would be accessible and also respond to the issues that mattered most in the particular places where they were operating. So to give a couple of examples of that, in Midlothian, they were particularly interested in how to communicate about climate change in an ex-coal mining area with a low standard of living. So we knew that a lot of the people living there felt somewhat excluded from conversations about climate change. I think particularly coal mining communities where there was a lot of pride in the coal mining heritage felt that they didn't have a place in climate movements which are obviously necessarily against fossil fuel extraction. And we found that a really effective way of doing this was working with the National Mining Museum, who are based in Midlothian, who had a really long-standing connection with the mining communities there. And because they were trusted messengers in that way, were able to carry these messages about climate change to ex-mining communities in a way that other organizations would have really struggled to do. They ran a lot of participatory projects. So rather than kind of creating pre-existing works of art, which were then shown to people, they involved people in the creation of art installations. You can see a picture in the middle of this graphic, this installation of miniature clay sculptures, which everyone contributed to, which, they were encouraged to create sculptures that reflected on something about the industrial heritage of the area, as well as their hopes and fears for the future around climate change. And then they were all installed in one space together with coal that had been extracted from the site. So something the artist talked about, an artist called Nicole Manley who worked on this, was that coal and clay are often found together when mining. So these things would have come up together, so that there was a sort of symbolic significance to bringing these things together. And we found that things like these kind of projects which involved just kind of bringing people together to kind of create little sculptures provided a very low barrier to entry, which then provided a way to bring people into conversation, which they might not have gone along to an event which was only to talk about climate change, but they would come along to a little crafting session and then be drawn into discussion that way. And it also provided a way to platform local voices and ideas. So by getting people to be involved in the actual making of artistic work, it provided a way to share their thoughts about what they wanted for their area. So for example, working with local school kids who were able to create their ideas for zero carbon towns in the future, and what they wanted their towns to look like in a world that was responding to climate change. And then just to give a contrasting example, there was also a climate beacon based up in the Outer Hebrides, And one of the things they wanted to work on was about how to adapt the islands to the worsening effects of climate change. So the Outer Hebrides are in many ways the place where climate change is hitting Scotland first, with more extreme weather events and a great deal of increasing erosion along the western coast of the islands as well. So they used the local art centres and libraries as hubs around the island, basically with pre-assessed audiences and profile. They ran mapping sessions with local residents, working with artists, and trying to do it in a way that felt creative and fun, but also provided a way to get real information. So the mapping sessions gathered people's local knowledge about where they were noticing changes to the weather or conditions in different parts of the islands, and that could actually feed into the plan for how the islands were going to adapt to climate change. Similarly, they ran storm stories sessions and storm Kayleigh sessions, which provided a way for people to share their stories about experiences of extreme weather. And then they collaborated actively with the Met Office. So I guess the UK's main organisation working on weather and climate and how it's affecting the country, and were able to feed those local stories into their own plans, as well as to communicate the Met Office's own findings effectively. So it became this sort of two-way exchange where they were using artistic methods to communicate scientific data, but also using those methods to gather information from people so that they could be heard effectively and feed back into ongoing research. So hopefully that's a couple of useful examples. There are many, many more, but I'm going to stop there, and thanks very much for listening. So that's kind of my more kind of technical background to this, kind of talking from my own experience and interests. I thought it would be really important, as well as me going on about this, to invite a real practicing artist to talk about their own experience. So really pleased to have Hannah Imlach with us in the room, who's going to talk about some of her work. So Hannah is a visual artist working predominantly in sculpture and photography. Her transient and site-specific works respond to particular ecologies, exploring sites of environmental conservation and renewable energy transition. These projects are initiated and sustained by opportunities to work with communities of specialist environmental knowledge, including scientific research groups, conservation charities, and community organizations. Her pieces focus on sensory interaction and are often foldable, faceted, or kinetic. So over to you, Hannah, to hear more about your work.
Thanks, Lewis. That was a great introduction. And I'm just really so happy to be here engaging with this different group, such a well-attended event, and really interesting from those post-it notes to hear about all the expertise in the room. So I look forward to hearing more about the initiatives and projects that you're all involved in the discussions that we're going to have later in the afternoon. So yes, as Lewis said, I'm a visual artist, but I'm also currently a doctoral researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and my PhD focuses on the creation of site-responsive sculpture in the Loch Lomond Nature Reserve. And it's a project done in partnership with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and the RSPB's largest, first Arts Humanities supported PhD project. So it's a bit of an experimental endeavour, but it positions me as an artist interestingly within a conservation organisation, and I'm also hosted within the School of Geosciences. So for me, it's a really interesting place to be making work about art, about environmental restoration, conservation, and it really provides an ideal context for my interests, which are for art ecology projects where creative practice is a mode of ecological observation and discovery. Creative practice forms a way of forging connections between communities and disciplines, and even between species. And my research really focuses on this. How can we make artworks and art spaces that encourage enthusiasm, attentiveness, and care for the natural world? So in this kind of short introduction, I'd like to speak from my own experiences of working on collaborative projects with environmental organisations. And I thought I'd position it quite practically, kind of going through one project chronologically and talking about the things that I felt made this project successful. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use a project that I worked on between the end of 2017 into 2019 with the Peatland Partnership in Caithness and Sutherland. So this was an 18-month artist residency focused on the creation of works informed by peatland research and restoration. It was part of a larger environmental restoration project called the Flows to the Future project, which many of you may have heard of. So that was a project to tackle the restoration of a vast area of blanket bog, which was devastated by monoculture forestry plantation in the 1980s. So it was quite ambitious in terms of its environmental scope and its public engagement scope, but I hope that many of the aspects and to do with my creative work in the Flow Country will be applicable to projects of different scales. But before I go into the Flow Country, go into that project, I'll just give a little bit more background to my creative practice. So this first slide is the front page of my website, which gives a bit of an overview of the type of work I've been doing over the last 12 years. So prior to my PhD, I worked as a freelance visual artist, working on projects, as Lewis said, that really look at sites that are undergoing significant changes through processes of restoration or renewable energy transition. And I primarily make site-specific sculpture or site-responsive, species-responsive artwork. I seek out these opportunities to work embedded within the communities of specialist environmental knowledge. So it's been really interesting to do artist residencies within scientific research groups studying deep sea, cold water coral, community groups looking at like those in Aberdeen and on the Isle of Egg, who have initiated their own renewable energy infrastructure and have gained energy autonomy, and larger organisations like the RSPB and their work in the Flow Country. So I'm really interested to work embedded within these organisations because of the kind of practices of environmental care and attunement, which I think are present in these sites and within these communities. And I'm really interested in how creative practice can open this knowledge, open these practices of environmental care and attunement to more diverse audiences. So the sculptures that I make are inspired by these particular ecological contexts and developed through a research-led process before being temporarily installed back in the environments that inspired them. So these installations are nearly always temporary and often coincide with a natural cycle, such as low tide or the presence of a particular migratory species. They are reactive to their environment to do with daylight, or the materials I use often are responsive to these environments, so they might be reflective, buoyant, transparent, or magnifying. So I often describe these sculptures as sensory prosthesis, a term I borrow from a geographer called Jamie Lorimer, and these are because they act as a way of extending the sensing capacities of the human body, allowing us to engage with the natural environment in ways that we may not otherwise be able to. So I create the sculptures, jumping PowerPoint. I create the sculptures using a combination of traditional and contemporary sculpture making processes, from woodwork and fabric manipulation to 3D printing and chemical etching. And I also work with specialist craft people to make work out of blown glass, metal, and other materials. So now I'll move to talk about one project in particular, and this is the work in the Flow Country. And I thought I'd start right at the beginning of this project to talk about how projects between artists and environmental organisations often are initiated and what makes a good beginning to such projects. So I thought it important to talk about the open call, because of course there are a myriad of approaches to creative practice, just as there are to environmental management and community engagement. So pairing the right artist for the right project, I think, is really crucially important. So I learned about the Flows to the Future opportunity through such an open call and what kind of really drew me to it was its clarity, detail, transparency, and scope. So I think the really important when you're developing a project like this is to have really clear intentions for the project through this open call without it being prescriptive. I think successful calls will encourage the applying artist to bring their own skills and knowledge and experience to the project, but also allow them space to work together with the project organisers to further develop and write that project. So I always think it's particularly off-putting when an open call describes the outcome. I think it's really important that it's more an invitation to co-develop that project together, and that the organisers embrace the skills that that artist brings. So the Flows to the Future brief that I responded to also had a really generous amount of information about the flow country, about the ecology of Blanket Bog, and about the history of the site. So I was able to take this and embed it within my application, make it more rigorous and site specific. There was details about the pool systems, about the dragonflies that were present, about the flow country during different times of year, about the research into deep peat. So all these kind of layers of detail built into the open call process, I think, are inspiring for artists. I think they generate enthusiasm and are really important for setting the intentions of a project. I think it's also really important when creating these types of open calls that we are transparent about expectations and the resources available to support projects of this nature. So, of course, really important to speak openly about the kind of financial resources, how an artist will be financially remunerated for their work. And there's really useful guidelines for this produced yearly by the Scottish Artists Union. But I think it's also really important when project planning to consider whatever resources an organisation can put in place to support a creative collaboration. So this could be to do with being able to introduce an artist to different communities and networks, to be able to provide accommodation, hospitality, travel, materials, support for installing or creating a work. So this definitely varies from project to project, but I think the giving detail and transparency about all those different things that can support and hold up an artist residency or another type of project is really important at the outset. And lastly, I was drawn to the Flows to the Future open call because of its scope. I think collaborative research-led projects are often slow to develop. As I will go on to describe, relationships involved take time. You need time to be immersed in these sites to understand the social and environmental ecology of the places that you're working in and responding to. So I was really encouraged by the opportunity to work on a more long-form timescale, the recurring motif that I think valuable projects often take quite a lot of time to develop. And having a project which encourages this scope of project and which allows artists to also develop new ways of working, to develop ambitious artwork and be able to experiment is really important. So I'd like to move now to talk about the process of doing or hosting an artist residency, which I'm titled Fieldwork and Hospitality. So artist residencies have become a central catalyst for my artistic practice. They provide a stimulus when you work, a space away from the usual distractions to think and experiment, the opportunity to immerse myself in a particular place, gather research material, make observations, speak to people, forge connections. And I think all these elements are really significant in the creation of an artwork that is truly reflective of and embedded within its context. In the Flow Country, I had the opportunity to conduct multiple residencies, each of a few weeks, from the newly built Scientific Fields Centre. At the centre, I was surrounded by conservation practitioners and peatland scientists involved in the work of restoring and monitoring the peatland. So I was able to go out and observe and participate in this work. I spent a day in a dry suit, floating in one of the pool systems, helping on a project to do with an endangered sea duck. I spent a number of days going to some of the flux tower sites where they collect atmospheric data from the bog. I spent time with RSPB kind of conservation practitioners looking at recently felled sites, trying to find indications of wildlife coming back to these kind of sites in flux. And these are really interesting conversations that happened whilst being out in this kind of vast landscape, which is otherwise quite difficult to navigate. And for me, these introductions that happened at the beginning of the residency, these opportunities to find key species, to find key sites, to observe and participate in the work being done in these places was really crucial in the development of the artwork. And being able to stay right in the middle of the site was an amazing opportunity. I think the hospitality shown to me at this initial stage is what I wanted to highlight. These research projects often have their own momentum, but kind of giving an arts practitioner those initial introductions and connections, that hospitality is really important. My residency in the Flow Country gave me a couple of key research areas to focus on. The first one I became particularly interested in was these flux towers and their scientific instruments. So these are things that I came back to in my sculptural work. So these on this slide are 3 of the images of instruments based in the peatland that I found particularly inspiring. So one of them is a golden rain gauge in the top left. The one underneath is an ultrasonic anemometer, so used to measure the 3D movement of wind. And the one on the right is a leaf wetness sensor, so used to indicate the kind of dew drops on leaves, or what that kind of scientifically equates to. So I was really fascinated by the scientists' work in the Flow Country, the labour that it took to monitor and maintain these instruments, and that dedication to kind of, understanding this delicate ecology of the bog. I also spent many days in researching the peatland plant life, going up to the University of the Highlands and Islands in Thurso to speak with a scientist called Roxanne Anderson about the sphagnum mosses and their vital role in restoring the peatland. And I became really interested through Roxanne and through one of her PhD researchers, Jasmine Simbenga, about the past botanical life of the bog. So looking at peat cores, looking at all the pollen captured in these peat cores, and thinking about what the botanical life of the bog was going back in time. Peat cores are an amazing kind of library of botanical information. And we had some fascinating conversations about how understanding what plant life was present on that site in the past could inform future restoration ideas about what plants could be introduced in our kind of age of rapidly warming climate. So I'm going to talk now about the collaborative process of developing artwork from these environmental residencies and the importance of communication throughout this process. For me, a sketchbook is a primary tool for gathering environmental research material and distilling it into the source material for sculptural artwork. My sketchbook also acts as an important communication tool, so I'm able to carry it into the field between meetings, to use it to communicate ideas that are in flux, all the different sources of inspiration. This animation is one of the Flow Country sketchbooks, where you can see some of these botanical references and the meteorological instruments starting to merge and combine into ideas for sculpture. So the sketchbooks combine my own research and drawing on site with archival sources, scientific papers, and importantly, notes from meetings and the ongoing email correspondence with some of the scientists and conservation practitioners that I met in the Flow Country. And these dialogues, these ongoing dialogues, were really important in fostering the work that I later produced. And in my doctoral project, I've taken that collaboration forwards, and I've developed an RSPB artwork working group made up of volunteers, wardens, scientists, those in public engagement and planning, and together we meet and discuss the aspects of developing an artwork, particularly tailored for the nature reserve in Loch Lomond, and that kind of collaborative process has been particularly useful. So I wanted to highlight the importance of clear communication through the artistic process, but also when a project perhaps takes an unexpected turn or evolves in a way that can be difficult to negotiate. With my Flow Country project, it definitely grew in ambition and scale, and with the project manager of the wider Flow Country project, we had to kind of renegotiate what the expectations of the project was and how it was to be supported. And I was really grateful that we had really clear communication from the beginning, and that we could talk about where the first kind of ambition of the project had ended and how it was going to extend. And I think the having that kind of productive, honest dialogue throughout was invaluable in terms of making sure that the outcomes fulfilled my expectations and that of the organisation. Sorry, conscious of time, I think I've spoken for a bit too long, but I'll just share quickly the outcomes of the project. And I apologise for using this word legacy, which is very cringeworthy, but I do think it's really important when we invest time in these projects and collaborations that there's ways of thinking about how that learning is taken forwards, how the work is shown in the future. So for me, my work in the Flow Country over 18 months resulted in a series of sculptures informed by peatland ecology and peatland plant life. And these sculptures were shown in an exhibition in Thurso near to the site that inspired them, also in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh in a subsequent exhibition. But perhaps more interestingly, the work went on to be shown in lots of different contexts, in peatlands, conferences and soil events to do with soil, as part of books, as part of new music concerts, in lots of different discursive events. So I've been really fascinated to see how the work from this project has continued to evolve, to be shared, to be featured in different places. And I think that's been one of the, I've been told this has been one of the really positive aspects of this project for RSPB, for the organisers, that it's gone to audiences in places that they couldn't have anticipated. So I'll stop there and apologise for that feeling a bit rushed. I'm very happy to discuss elements of that as we go forwards.
Thanks very much, Hannah. And yes, Hannah will be around with us for the whole of the rest of this event. So there should be plenty of opportunities to chat to her about her work and all the other useful insights she has to share. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to give you a chance to actually speak and share your thoughts, having heard plenty from us. So we're going to split into a few breakout rooms now, so 6 breakout rooms. And in each breakout room, you'll be given a prompt, which will be some sort of creative or artistic approach to communicating about climate change. And we'll just invite you to think about it, respond to it, and then discuss together how you think it works, what issue you think is being addressed, what's interesting about it, how it might apply to your own context, how you might have used that approach differently from your own field or the place where you're based, which I think will just, provide a chance maybe to get more into the detail of how we think creative approaches to communicating climate change work, and how we might apply them to our own contexts. And then following on from that, we'll come back from that and sort of share our thoughts, and then we'll have a second set of breakout rooms where we'll have a chance to plan an imagined cultural approach to communicating about a climate change issue. So I'll explain a bit more about that later on, but I think hopefully this first breakout will just give a chance to kind of get ourselves thinking, and then the second one we'll try and get into the detail of how we might actually plan something that draws on arts and cultural approaches. We've sort of pre-planned the breakout rooms so that hopefully people who are based in similar locations are close to each other as far as possible. So there's going to be one kind of for the Highlands, one for the northeast of Scotland, and one for Lothian and the borders. Apologies, people in the borders, there weren't enough of you to have a separate room. One for kind of Glasgow and the Strathclyde area, and one for people who are based in the rest of the UK and Ireland, who I think we have a few with us here. And if you're based from beyond the UK, then you're going to be put into one of those other groups. So you'll have a chance to mix with a surprise group, which should be an interesting chance to share some kind of international learning as well. So hopefully that all makes sense. You'll have a facilitator with you in each room who will help be able to explain and lead you through things. Before then, we'll just take a quick screen break. So we'll come back for 4 p.m. to split into our breakout room discussions, and we'll just have 5 minutes before then just to have a bit of time away from the screen and get a drink or go to the toilet or whatever you fancy. So see you back here at 4.